Well,
Get roll.
oh, there she comes. 30 seconds.
I was close. All right, so good official afternoon. We've just passed 12 o'clock. Hope that everyone is doing well and having a good week studying one of the very interesting sections of Torah that often gets short shrift, which is Parashat Mishpatim. And Mishpatim would very easily be translated as laws or ordinances. So before we get into our ordinances, I want to try and do a little comparative legal theory. Don't worry, that's not as scary as it sounds. What are some of the rules of the road? If you were going to explain to somebody who had never driven a car what the laws are governing driving a car, what would you say?
Drive on the right side of the road.
Drive on the right side of the road. What if there are two lanes? I mean, like, what if there's like 2 lanes on the right and 2 lanes on the left? Do I have to drive in the far right lane?
Yes.
If you're that new, you should.
If you're new to driving, maybe that's a good idea. Okay. What are some of the other the rules?
Red light, green light, yellow light, what they each mean.
Red light, green light, yellow light. What do they mean?
Stop signs and yield signs.
Stop. So stop at a stop sign.
Yeah.
And what happens if 2 cars get to their stop signs at the same time?
Guy on the right has the right of way.
The guy on the right has the right of way.
Oh, stop sign's the first guy there. The yield sign.
Stop. Okay. Stop sign. So you stop at a stop sign.
Yeah, definitely.
But you have to see if there's someone else stopped. If they stop before you stop, they go first. But if you stopped at the same time as they stopped, then whoever's on the right of the other person goes first.
You passed your test.
Okay. And what if there's a pedestrian? Does the pedestrian have to wait for the cars to go, or do we have to wait for the pedestrian to cross?
You get extra points for knocking out pedestrians.
You get extra points for hitting the pedestrian. Okay. Remind me not to walk in your neighborhood.
It's on which city you're in and whether there's
A crosswalk.
Paint a crosswalk or not, exactly. And what about at the stop light? At a stop light, do I take turns then with all the other cars?
Yeah.
No, but so it's not like a stop sign? No, and can I turn right? Though on a red light,
Please stop first.
if you stop first. Yeah, I notice a lot of people around here sort of forget that part. Depends on what state you're in. Some states you do have to stop and then you can go on the right. Some states you can't do it at all, and some states they just ignore the law. But that's actually not a law. It's more of a custom. It's, oh, so this is it's interesting because we began with very general statements. You know, you stop at a stop sign. But if that was all the information you gave to someone, they'd be in trouble if they get behind the wheel of a car. And we're going to take a look at, a little bit differently than we have recently at some of the mitzvot that are mentioned in Mishpatim. There are a lot of them. We're not going to be looking at all of them. And the way that Judaism tries to understand them. So this style of class is going to be a little different than usual. And hopefully it'll be a nice change and to see another aspect of Jewish learning. And if you find it not exactly your cup of tea, don't worry, we're not going to be doing this every week. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone. So before we can get into the specifics, though, we need to get into the generalities, which means we need some mitzvahs to talk about. So please open up your Chumashim, your Torahs, to page 460 if you are in the Eitz Chaim. Or Exodus chapter 21, verse 18, if you're using any other edition. We all set? Roughly?
Yeah.
Yes? 460 in the Eitz Chaim. And we're on chapter 21 of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, verse 18. All right. Shall we begin? Do I have to pick someone? Oh, Mary, were you volunteering?
When men quarrel and one strikes the other with stone or fist, and he does not die but has to take to his bed.
Meaning the guy who was hit.
If he then gets up and walks outdoors upon his staff, the assailant shall go unpunished, except that he must pay for his idleness and is cured.
All right. What are we talking about here? You see billboards for it all over town.
Yes.
Personal injury. Did you think the Torah didn't cover personal injury? You think the Torah was only about sacrifices and Shabbat and kashrut? No. And in fact, we'll see that there's more to say about topics like this than there is to say about many of the ritual topics that you might be more familiar with. All right, so what's the law? If you were going to restate it in more natural English?
If you hurt somebody, you have to pay them.
If you hurt someone, you have to pay them.
Their medical expenses and their time lost from work.
Medical expenses
And time
lost from work.
idleness.
Okay. How much do I have to pay for their time lost from work? Do I have to pay what their salary is? And what if they
That's tough to get a brain surgeon.
and what if they get like relapses? You know, what if the symptoms don't manifest until like 2 years later?
Call 800, pay.
That's what we have lawyers for. I think what you're saying. Okay, well, we're going to see. We'll wrestle with those. All right, but let's keep going. We need a few more mitzvahs.
When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and he dies there and then, he must be avenged. But if he survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, since he is the other's property.
Very, very complicated, very, very controversial statement. Not as bad as it seems, and not as good as perhaps as we'd like. One of the things I like to point out to people is that the Torah presents us in many cases with the minimum of morality. That does not mean we cannot increase our morality in cases like this. So although the Torah allowed for the circumstances of its generation, which was essentially a generation where people often had to indenture themselves, that doesn't mean that we should permit such occurrences to take place. We have at our disposal the wealth and the societal tools to make sure no one has to be in these positions. But back then, it was a necessary point it was a necessary idea to point out that there were consequences to hitting a slave, and that despite the fact that they are in certain legal ways considered property, you do not have the ability to kill them the way you do like your cattle, for example. If a man slaughters his own cow, he has not committed a transgression. If a man slaughters a servant, he has absolutely committed a transgression.
We're certainly familiar with the American slave system, in which there would be no punishment for killing your own property. But
correct.
Under the Roman law, Roman jurisprudence, it was different, because killing of a slave was considered to harm the economic output of the empire. Therefore, whoever kills a slave has harmed the economy of the empire, and that would be a punishable offense.
Right, but not the same punishment as killing a free man.
No.
Right.
But it would certainly be, there was a difference.
Right. Okay. Keep going. Oh, question first?
Yeah. Does it apply, because it doesn't say here, when we read 19, it says, and they say he should go unpunished except that he must pay for his idleness and his cure.
Mm-hmm.
Does that apply to the slave also?
In terms of the cure and such, yes.
You know, yeah, right.
Yes,
Okay.
the slave was still due certain rights in terms of the treatment, as we're going to see in more detail what's going to happen in just the very next section. Whoop. It's okay, we're just bouncing the camera a bit.
Sorry.
There wasn't an earthquake in Florida, don't worry. Just trying to accommodate more students, and just trying to make sure the focus is still on. All right, I think we're okay. All right.
When men fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Okay.
I've always found the beginning part of that very interesting, and I've quoted it
Mm-hmm.
to my Christian friends who believe in the Bible.
Right.
But it turns out, if a miscarriage results and no other damage, therefore a miscarriage is not considered damage, it's
Oh,
reprehensible.
it's considered damage, but it is not considered murder. It is not considered an injury to an independent being.
That's correct. And
Correct.
that's a very interesting point of view early on here,
Yes.
in terms of what they think of later. I knew you in the womb.
Yes. And that's the difference between metaphor and legal statements.
Yes.
Metaphorically, we can say all sorts of things, but legally, you have to set the boundaries of when exactly an independent creature exists.
So we need some rabbis to interpret this, don't we?
We do.
Yes.
We're not going to see them today.
Okay.
But there are lots of them who do. All right, keep going.
When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth.
Okay, so as you mentioned before, we were briefly discussing the issue of slavery. Here we get a little bit of a continuation of that topic, which is, yes, you may be in certain circumstances permitted to have somebody who is working for you in a long-term uncompensated capacity. It's sort of a fancy way of saying slavery, but without all the connotations of American slavery, which is not identical, because as we can see from here, you hit your slave to make him work harder and you knock out a tooth, you've just lost yourself a slave. That the slave is now going free in compensation for the damage, the injury you've done to him. And same with an eye and other types of wounds of similar vein.
If he goes free, how does he support himself? He's been a slave his whole life.
Well, we know that when you allowed slaves to go free from other sections of the Torah, you didn't let them go empty-handed. So not only were you losing a slave, but you would also be providing them with the stipend that you were supposed to provide them at the end of their years of service, just a little prematurely. Is there another?
One thing about this slavery, there was always an end.
Yes, there was always an end. There's some controversy regarding the specific category of the Canaanite slaves, of those that were in the land at the time of the conquest, as opposed to other nations or, of course, Israelites. But in almost all circumstances, there was meant to be an end in sight. Yes. All right. We still have miles to go.
Okay. When an ox gores a woman or a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox is not to be punished. If, however, that ox has been in the habit of goring, and its owner, though warned, has failed to guard it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner too shall be put to death. If ransom is laid upon him, he must pay whatever is laid upon him to redeem his life. So too, if it gores a minor, male or female, the owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. But if the ox gores a slave, male or female, he shall pay 30 shekels of silver to the master, and the ox shall be stoned.
Okay, oh, come back up there. So we're dealing with the case here of runaway property. If you have an ox and it's damaging, if you have a pet panther and it attacks someone, if you have a pit bull, for example, and it attacks and bites someone, what's the liability of the owner?
Depends on whether it's the first offense.
Depends on whether it's the first offense, and actually the rabbis will also add in, it also depends on whether it's in the nature of the animal to be violent. So, for example, the rabbis say if you own a poisonous cobra, or if you own a lion, it is already considered a priori, to borrow Latin for the Hebrew discussion, it is already considered, before anything has actually been done, to be violent by nature. And therefore, on its first offense, the owner is considered liable if he was negligent in protecting against it.
Remember, this was in my law school when we talked about things like dog bites and liability. The Code of Hammurabi also deals with this issue in a similar way, but again, it was the issue of the propensity to violence and your likely pre-knowledge, foreknowledge of the danger of this beast that's supposedly under your control.
And whether you've taken steps to safeguard the public from the propensity to violence, as you put it. Exactly. All right. You can see we've got a long list here. Remember how many different little details we had just talking about a stop sign? Well, wait till we start digging on this.
When a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or an ass falls into it, the one responsible for the pit must make restitution. He shall pay the price to the owner, but shall keep the dead animal. When a man's ox injures his neighbor's ox and dies, they shall sell the live ox and divide its price. They shall also divide the dead animal. If, however, it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring, and its owner has failed to guard it, he must restore ox for ox, but shall keep the dead animal.
Got all that? Yeah, okay. So if my ox gores your ox, then we split. No, if my ox has gored before and now it gores again, I have to give you a new ox, but I get to keep my dead ox. Ah! This is why we study law. And as you can imagine, taking this and applying it to life, as opposed to the isolated case of ox versus ox, which is on pay-per-view, I think, tonight, is why you have to study. It is why Torah requires more than simply reading in order to understand what it is that God wants us to do in our day-to-day lives.
Another verse 33 about the pit open. This was also used as a citation in pools. The law about pools. Parent leaves, your neighbor leaves their pool wide open, a child comes in and falls into it, you're liable. And everybody who owns property these days understands you have to secure your pool, which is a pit filled with water. So the
which in many ways makes it an even more dangerous pit.
So the children can't come in and just fall in.
Right.
This is all the same underlying theory here about property liability.
Indeed, much of American law, through many other courses, has been derived, or at least derived from parallels to Torah.
But it's not just American law, it's the whole entire English-speaking common law, the common law which developed out of the Lex Mercantilia, the merchant law, which was the Christian and Jews merchants getting together and making common understanding is what was expected. And
I hope we can also understand that there are options here. I mean, that's not an option, it's Torah, so there's no option for us. But if you were going to sit down with a blank slate and try and write a law about pits, you might come up on your own with a different conclusion, right? I mean, we can conceive of saying, well, you know, a pit is a pit, and as long as you didn't camouflage it, why should I be responsible that you were too busy texting to notice where you were stepping? You know, it's your fault for falling into my pit, not my fault for having a pit that you fell into.
Or it's your fault, your ox or your child fell in.
Right. Or if you would, I mean, what happens if my ox gets out and gores your donkey, which also got out? Well, if you tied up your donkey properly, why should I be responsible for its damage? But Judaism says, well, actually, yes, you still are. And it's partly that reason that we look to Torah to provide us with a baseline of revelation, that there are certain truths that we need to derive our moral and legal system from, which are subject to dispute if we do not ascribe to them a divine sanctity. Now, their interpretation, of course, is wide open within the spectrum of acceptable rational thought, but the baseline start place has to be a shared assumption, and that assumption for us comes from Torah. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay, just a little bit more. We're just stacking them up. We're not going to look into all of these in such detail, but I wanted to show you how dense the laws can be in the Torah and how much more work goes into actually applying them as we get down to work. I think we're now at the very end of chapter 21 on verse 37. Yes?
When a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep.
All right, so this is the payment of restitution for having stolen something. And now we're into chapter 22, which continues this theme of thieving in particular, but also the theme of general laws.
If the thief is seized while tunneling and he is beaten to death, there is no blood guilt in his case. If the sun has risen on him, there is blood guilt in that case. He must make restitution. If he lacks the means, he shall be sold for his theft. But if what he stole, whether ox or ass or sheep, is found alive in his possession, he shall pay double. All
right, so we go a little digression to talk about the rights of the property owner to defend the property with or without lethal force. And then we go back to the other details of compensation for having stolen something. Make sense? All right, that line, of course, about the thief coming into the house at night or coming in during the day, and whether or not the property owner has the right to use lethal force has been a very important mainstay in Jewish conception of property rights versus the right to life, even of criminals, and one that we're not going to look at today.
When a man lets his livestock loose to graze in another's land, and so allows a field or a vineyard to be grazed there, he must make restitution for the impairment of that field or vineyard. When a fire is started and spreads to thorns, so that standing or growing grain is consumed, he who started the fire must make restitution.
So we got that. If you let your animals out and they just do the little buzz saw and cut everything down in someone else's field, you can't say, well, I didn't do anything, it was my sheep. You have to pay restitution for the damages that your animals have caused through their chewing. And similarly, if you light a fire and the fire gets out of control, you can't say, well, I didn't do it. I didn't light your field on fire. I was just burning leaves in my backyard. So, if the sparks got carried away and went into yours, God did that, not me. Well, no, Torah says you are responsible. Make sense?
There's no restitution though. The other ones it says they pay double or 4 times.
You mean in terms of additional penalties? And actually, we're going to see at least some of the general statements about the differentiations between the different categories of damage that you or your property may cause to someone else. So, good eye.
When a man gives money or goods to another for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall depose before God that he has not laid hands on the other's property. In all charges of misappropriation pertaining to an ox, an ass, sheep, a garment, or any other loss, whereof one party alleges, this is it, the case of both parties shall come before God. He whom God declares guilty shall pay double to the other.
All right, keep going in this context.
When a man gives to another an ass, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to guard, and it dies or is injured or is carried off with no witness about, an oath before the Lord shall decide between the two of them that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. The owner must acquiesce, and no restitution shall be made. But if the animal was stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it was torn by beasts, he shall bring it as evidence. He need not replace what has been torn by beasts.
And one more paragraph on the topic. We're down in verse 13.
When a man borrows an animal from another and it dies or is injured, its owner not being with it, he must make restitution. If its owner was with it, no restitution need be made. But if it was hired, he is entitled to the hire.
All right, hope that's all clear. Yeah, a lot? Yes? Quite dense?
Yes.
You ain't seen nothing. Okay. Because our sages of blessed memory said, it's not just enough to state a general principle of a law. And these may seem specific, but we all know from personal experience that there are hundreds and hundreds of sub-details that would go into deciding each one of these cases. And so our ancestors compiled their understanding of the received tradition of how to actually apply these laws. Now, we're not going to go into every detail because then we would be here for the rest of our lives studying, God willing. We'll have that opportunity in another context, but not for this hour. But I did want to share with you how it is and what it looks like when our tradition takes things apart. Did we run out of handouts? No, we have some more on the other table. Okay. So the samples that we're using here are taken from the Mishnah. Has anyone here had a chance to study Mishnah before in any capacity? Let me ask you this. Has anyone here studied what's called Pirkei Avot, or the sayings of our fathers? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me, yada, yada, yada. Not yada, yada, it's beautiful stuff, but that is part of Mishnah. That is the more homiletical section of Mishnah, and that's about that much of Mishnah. The rest of Mishnah is about like that. And the rest of the Mishnah looks a lot more like what you've got in front of you, which is the statements of tradition and the disputes about the tradition, about how to apply the law as it needs to be applied to real life, rather than simply being stated in the Torah as a broad principle. The Mishnah is, I like to say that the Torah itself is like a symphony, right? There are so many instruments playing simultaneously, so many underlayers of music and themes, that if you try to repeat a symphony on your own, in your regular life, on the way to work, just going to hum it to yourself, you can't actually duplicate the symphony on its own. But if you unpack all those layers of the symphony, you can probably pull out one or two lines that you'll be able to hum or to whistle, depending upon your ability, quite satisfactory. We can all do dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. We don't need a symphony to do that. But we can capture part of what's being said by Beethoven's Fifth with that. Similarly, the Mishnah tries to help us capture part of what the Torah is saying and the part that we need to be used in a particular aspect of life. Does that make sense? So the Mishnah helps us whistle the symphony of Torah in a way that we can actually carry with us without the entire symphony band with us. Symphony orchestra, I think we say. All right, good. If you're not confused yet, hold on. So we started off talking a lot about punching people, hurting other people, whether it be a slave or not, whether it be a woman who was pregnant or not. And I thought it would be good to start off with how the rabbis understood that whole eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., as a blanket statement. They did not believe that it meant that if you poke out my eye, I poke out your eye. Let's make sure we all understand that. And nowhere in Jewish writings, that is to say, nowhere in the rest of the entire Tanakh, is that applied in such a literal fashion. You never see King David poking out someone's eye who poked out someone else's eye. You never hear of Solomon's justice being to cut off the hand of one who cut off the hand of someone else. But in rabbinic writings as well, the rabbis considered it preposterous that anyone would assume that this meant a literal one-for-one duplication of wound from the victim to the attacker. Instead, they believed that it meant a fair compensation for the damage that had been caused, and that it shouldn't be more than the actual fair compensation, and it shouldn't be less than the fair compensation. That is to say, an eye should be compensated for an eye's worth. A wound should be compensated for that wound's amount, and you should neither increase nor decrease beyond what was appropriate, which of course is going to leave us with the giant question, what's appropriate then? All right, so that's where we're going to start in our Mishnah. Who would like to read a little Mishnah? Don't worry, we're going to take it nice and easy, and you don't have to worry about getting overwhelmed.
If one wounds his fellow, he is liable thereby of 5 rounds.
All right, so let's make sure we got this plan. If you hit someone, you cause damage to someone else, there are going to be 5 different categories that are going to be assessed, and the total of which will be what you have to pay as compensation.
For damage, for pain, for healing, for loss of time, and for insult.
All right, so each one of those 5 categories is going to have to be weighed, measured, until we have that you then have to pay in total to the victim of your assault. We're doing all right? Good.
So how then, in the case of damage, is the extent of the actual harm to be ascertained? If one blinded another's eye, or cut off his hand, or broke his foot or leg, they consider him as if he were a slave to be sold in the market, and they appraise him how much he was worth before the hurt and what he's now worth.
All right. Do you understand the mechanics there? If you want to know how much that man's hand was worth, we assess what could I have sold him for with the hand, and now that he's missing the hand, what can I sell him for? And the difference in price is the amount of payment that will have to be paid for the damage that was caused. Okay, this is for the actual damage. Again, remember we have more than just damage that's going to go into the total calculation, but this aspect is being calculated in the one-time only value of selling this person pre-damage and post-damage. Yes? No? Maybe?
So does this presume a market for slavery in which that could be an ascertainable fact?
Absolutely. This assumes that you know what people go for.
What slaves are worth. So
what slaves are going.
Presumption that there's a slave market that can be used as a reference point to ascertain.
Correct. And it's essential, really, because Judaism in general does not have a valuation on people that differs based upon their ability. So, for example, the erech vow, the erech donation, which is a donation that's mentioned in the book of Leviticus, is based on the individual being human. And there's some issues with regards to differences in age and differences in gender, but nothing about the individual representative. So somebody who is completely unable to earn a living, that is an amputee or has an eye poked out, is going to be donating the same amount as a similar person who has both eyes or who has both arms. So Judaism doesn't in itself make a different valuation of what each limb is worth. So the rabbis had to find another objective standard which they could use to measure the monetary worth as opposed to the spiritual worth of a person in order that they could properly put a price tag on the damage itself that had been done. Now make sure you understand, we're going to get to pain in a minute. So we're not talking about how much it hurt to have your eye put out. We're talking about what you have lost by not having your eye. As if the eye had just been blinked out of your head rather than poked out, stabbed out, burnt out, or whatever else might have happened. Do you have a question? Or?
You're saying that they obtained how much a hand is worth because of the slave's hand is worth?
How much that person's hand would have been worth. So, we mentioned a brain surgeon a few minutes ago. If you were going to buy a brain surgeon in the marketplace, you would probably assess his hands as being a rather important aspect of his capacity as being a brain surgeon for your hospital where you have slave doctors. Some doctors tell me they feel like that anyway. But therefore, obviously, his value would be greatly diminished by having had his hand. So we're going to get to a more employment neutral measure in a little bit. But when it comes to assessing the damage to body parts, it's how much that person would have been worth with and without that body part that was injured.
That precept is still reflected in the damage laws today for personal injury. Little old ladies, because of their future earnings capacity, so minimal, never get medical malpractice claims because there's no damages in that sense. Whereas a young, healthy person.
You're in a room full of good old.
But he's restating American jurisprudence. He's not making a personal assessment.
No moral judgment. This is simply how the law works.
Right, and we should note as well that at least with regards to Judaism, if you were to hurt someone in a way that didn't cause lasting damage, that doesn't mean you're off the hook. You wouldn't have to pay any damage from among this 5-part equation, but you're absolutely going to have to be ponying up for the other 4 parts of what you have done. Well, depending upon the extent of damage, as we'll see. Okay, good.
The indemnity for pain is assessed like this. If one burns a person, even if merely on his fingernail where it produces no wound, they assess how much such a man of his position would be willing to accept to suffer this.
Okay, so how much does it hurt to be shot in the foot? You want to know how much it hurts to be shot in the foot? Would you let me shoot you in the foot for $100?
No.
Would you let me shoot you in the foot, even if it heals perfectly? So we're just talking about the amount of pain. Would you let me shoot you in the foot for $1,000? No. Just the pain. Again, it's going to heal perfectly. It'll be just as good as new. Just that amount of pain. Would you have suffered that pain for $1,000? Would you, what about $10,000? Keep going. And that's the idea, is if you want to know how much you have to compensate someone for the pain that you inflicted on them involuntarily, we have to ascertain what someone like him or her would have charged for you to voluntarily inflict such pain on them.
I would want to point out, just in defense, in malpractice law, this is usually the only form of damages, is the pain and suffering. So
Right.
when you read in the newspaper, there's a debate to cut down on what is permitted in pain and suffering. Understand that's simply the people then who don't have the monetary damages. That's who it hurts.
Who it hurts, exactly.
The little old lady. So,
Excuse me.
You should have stopped there. Okay. Yeah. Let's make sure that we don't actually create any assault cases in the room, because whether for good or for bad, we don't get to adjudicate in America according to these laws unless you choose to have your case be settled under rabbinic law. Most of you would probably go to the American court system to find satisfaction. All right, onward.
For healing, if one struck another, he must heal him by paying for all the necessaries entailed. If ulcers appear on him, then if they be formed in consequence of the blow, he's liable. But if not by reason of the blow, he is exempt. If the wound healed up and then reopened and healed again and opened up once more, he is liable for all expenses to cure him. But once it has healed up thoroughly, he is no longer liable to heal him.
All right, so you hit me in the head, and it takes years before I get my vision straight again. You're paying for all my doctor visits. Okay? On the other hand, if you hit me in the head, it gets perfectly fine and I'm back to normal, and then 3 years later, I have some other trauma that the doctors do not believe is connected to my head injury. Even if I think it is, you're not liable for that. This is where the medical assessment becomes very, very important. So if the doctors say these ulcers, these extra wounds, or this infection, or this rash is caused by the wound you caused to him, you're paying. On the other hand, the doctors say, no, he went through some poison oak. That's why he's got this horrible rash. You're not liable for curing the poison oak part of his current condition. Make sense?
Yeah.
Sound fair? Of course it's fair. It's Torah. Okay.
For loss of time, they consider him as if he were a watchman over a cucumber field.
All right. So
Brain surgeon.
rather than a brain surgeon, exactly. So this is something that is very, very different than the American system. If you want to know how much you get paid for having to stay home and lie in bed, remember they didn't have hospitals back then, and get better, they say, well, what would we pay you to do the most minimal job possible, which is to stand in a field of cucumbers and make sure they don't get stolen.
but that's how jurors are compensated.
And that's how jurors are compensated rather than victims, yes.
If at all.
If much at all, it barely compensate the gasoline. But the idea here being, of course, is you've already been paid for the damages, which, if you were the brain surgeon, your loss of future ability to work has already been covered, if it was your hands that were taken off or your eyes. So your value in terms of earning potential has already been covered under damages. The amount of pain you suffered has already been covered by the pain assessment of what you would have charged to have that done to you, which I guess for some people might be very low. Some people pay to have things done, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And on the other hand, your healing has also already been covered, so they're not paying additionally for the hospital. That's already been wrapped up in the first one, or the prior category. They're now just paying for what it is you are unable to earn from being completely idle. And to understand what you would have earned if you weren't completely idle, they say, well, what is one step above being completely idle? And it's being a cucumber watchman. It's not exactly what you call a taxing position. Usually people who aren't necessarily in the best of physical condition or health can still do it and still collect a salary. And therefore, if you are totally unable to even do that, then we'll charge the assailant the salary that would have gone along with at least doing that. And the presumption is that if your wounds are so bad that you can't do your regular job, you would still get that minimum job in the meantime. You would still be collecting a salary on your own. Make sense? Yeah? You're not happy about that?
You see, you'll give me a minimum wage job, and I got the kids in college. I still have the expenses, and you're not paying me what I would have been able to earn if I'd have been out there.
but I'm paying you for your diminished capacity to work based upon the damages I caused to you. So if you're a movie star and I disfigure your face, then I'm going to be on the hook for a big ton of cash. On the other hand, if I break your arm, you can't sit at home and say, "Oh, I can't go to work. My children are going to starve." Get out there and work. You can still do your job. If you can't do your job, then we're looking at you as diminished capacity, and it goes back to damages.
If somebody blinded the person, they can't be a watchman in a cucumber field.
Or not a very good one. Halt! Who goes there?
Tell me, you've got to tell me.
No. Can you describe yourself? I need to be able to tell the officials. Okay. One last category. Insult.
For insult, all in accordance with the social status of the one causing the indignity and of the one insulted.
All right, so if you want to know how much for the humiliation, which is really what's being called insult here more generally in English, then you have to be able to measure the relative standing of the two participants. I know that makes our American hackles go up, doesn't it? But, no? Yes? Maybe?
It's an ancient tradition. Go back to laws of defamation. I mean, if you defame a young lady or virgin by describing to her immoral characteristics, in the law of defamation, that's always been something that created much higher damages.
So if I dump a load of manure on somebody who is a field hand, right? Should they be compensated the same amount as if I dump a load of manure on somebody who is considered to be, give me somebody esteemed in our society? Do we have anyone left? No. There's got to be someone esteemed. The mayor of the town, a well-respected doctor, somebody who is an upstanding businessman or woman of the community, and of unquestionable and unimpeachable virtue. We're going to talk about that in a minute, a little bit more about the insult. Can we see that there might have been more embarrassment and humiliation, not just caused but intended in the act? Right? I mean, if I play a prank on my college buddy and drop an egg on him, was I trying to cause the level of embarrassment that I would also be causing if I were to drop an egg on the President of the United States? I'm trying to generate more humiliation in the second case than the first. So wouldn't it make sense that I would be charged more?
Yeah.
Well, if you did it to a private citizen, nothing would happen to you.
Yeah, well, the Secret Service would shoot me, but that...
on the wrist. But if you did it to the president, that's another story.
Well, perhaps a better analogy might be, if you did it to your buddy in college, not much would happen. But if you threw an egg at the professor standing in front of the classroom, that would be a much more chargeable offense. I think probably.
Well, but technically I've done the same act to both. Yeah. So we do recognize that under certain circumstances, the relative status of people does influence our assessment of what is or is not fair in terms of the compensation for the deed. So we have certainly diminished much of that under American law, but not entirely.
So are we saying that if a fellow professor of equal rank threw the egg, then there wouldn't be as much insult?
Quite probably. There wouldn't be as much, indeed, although causing humiliation to a respected teacher would probably still be more, it would still cause a higher penalty than causing respect to student. So even though the relative ranks are the same, the rank in society is significantly different, and therefore the amount of humiliation the person suffers would be greater. The principle is essentially that the amount of honor a person has to lose determines the amount that can be lost and therefore must be compensated. And as most college students have very little honor, at least as I remember, there's not much to be compensated if it's lost. On the other hand, as we hope, our teachers have a great deal of honor and respect in our society, there's much further for their honor to be diminished, and therefore much more is required to compensate that, that diminishment. All right, we're going to see a little bit more of putting this into application, and this topic will be rehashed before we're done today. And we're running late. As you can see, once you get down into the weeds, things take a lot more thought. Keep going.
If one insults a naked person or insults a blind person or inflicts indignity on a sleeping person, he is liable. But if a sleeping person causes that indignity, he is not liable.
Why do we have to be told that? Why do I have to be told that if I, run up to somebody who's sleeping and go in the front of everybody else, teasing somebody who's blind, who doesn't even see what I'm doing, why am I being told this? Or a naked person?
Position of power.
It's a position of power, and it's also a position of awareness. Yeah. Just because the victim is unaware of the damage that's been inflicted doesn't mean damage was not intended, and therefore you are still liable. And the case of being naked, just because a person apparently has no honor left to lose, they have already been stripped bare, doesn't mean you can do whatever you feel like, because, hey, what damage can I do to someone who's already at zero? So there's a notion here that people still have dignity and still need to be defended, even if they're unaware of the crime or even if they have nothing left to lose from what you're doing. And the opposite is the case as well, that if someone is asleep, why are they not responsible for for part of what they do? If they cause insult to someone. If I sleepwalk into the middle of a room and I swear at somebody in public, insulting them, I haven't wounded them, I'm just insulting or humiliating them, why am I not responsible for that insult? It's a matter of intent. I wasn't trying to do anything, I was asleep. On the other hand, we do find out that if I slap someone while I'm sleepwalking and knock out a tooth, that I'm going to have to pay for. I don't have to pay for the insult, but I do have to pay for the damages. And that gets a little bit more on the next line. Go ahead and keep reading.
If one fell from a roof and caused injury and inflicted disgrace, both at the same time, he is liable to pay compensation for the injury, but he is exempt for the disgrace. As it is said, and she puts forth her hand and takes hold of his secrets.
As in his secret parts.
As one is not liable to pay a fine for inflicting indignity unless he intends to cause it.
Right. She put forth her hand and took hold of his secret parts. If it was just she was fallen and happened to hit him in the family jewels, then she would be responsible for the damage being done to him, but wouldn't be responsible for having caused additional humiliation. Similarly, if someone falls off a roof and on their way down, they pull off the pants of the guy who was holding the ladder, he's responsible for the damage he might cause to the guy holding the ladder, but he's not going to be penalized for having humiliated him by pulling his pants down in public. Because he wasn't trying to, it was just the course of his fall. Does that make sense? Maybe? What's that?
Not that one.
Not the, I didn't mean he's trying to pull the pants. I mean, he's like grabbing at anything to keep himself from hitting the ground.
Why would he be liable for damages if he's not, there's no intent, it's an accident?
We can talk about when, and the Mishnah does go into the difference between causing damage through negligence or through other problems that you should have been aware of and prevented in the first place. And if you're falling off the roof, not because you were messing around, but just because the roof broke, then usually, yes, you are excused from damages if it is just a complete accident, and then you and he are both victims of whatever happened on that disaster. Okay. I always forget how long these discussions of law take. Okay, this is why we don't do it every week. All right, so let's get a little bit more about damages, just because that dignity issue I know is going to be sticking, so I wanted to give at least one other perspective on it. The social status. So who wants to read a little bit more? Edie, you look eager.
If one cuffs this fellow, he must pay him a selah.
A cuff in this case is probably like cuffing someone along the ear. You know, it gives them a ring on the head, but it's not a significant blow. We're not talking about just punching someone. It's giving them a little whack up upside the head. Or it's also translated in some places as being like shouting in someone's ear, but loud enough that it's uncomfortable.
What's a selah?
What's a selah? It's the thing underneath the house where you store things. If you look on the back page, we've got an attempt at putting together a conversion chart Okay, so you need 25 sela to make 1 zuz.
Okay.
And you probably know the phrase zuz from a couple of different sources. You'll know it from the holiday coming up in just a little over a month. Pesach, right? Chad Gadya, the zuzim, right? 2 zuzim. So that's one thing to know. The other place you might know zuzim would be on your ketubah. Zuz is still the denomination that's used on most ketubot, and you're looking for a value there anywhere from like 100, 200 or so or up. Can be as much as the guy wants to put on. But 25 sela goes into 1 zuz. So it's 1 sela is not exactly a huge amount of money. It's not insignificant, but it's not completely trivial. So it's a minor offense, so it's a minor penalty. Keep going.
Rabbi Judah, in the name of Rabbi Jose the Galilean, says amana.
Amane, right, which is, as you can see, an awful lot more. If 25 sela go into 1 zuz and 100 zuz go into 1 maneh, then you're looking at like 2,500 times the amount. So he thinks it's a much more substantial damage than was originally assessed.
If he slapped him, he must pay him 200 zuz.
Now we're just talking open face, slap across the face. Open hand, slap across the face.
If he hit him with the back of his hand, he must pay him 400 zuz.
Because the back of the hand, we know, is a lot harder and a lot more embarrassing, at least within their society.
If he split his ear, plucked out his hair, spat at him, and the spittle touched him, stripped his cloak from him, or bared the head of a woman in the street, he must pay 400 zuz.
All right, so even the splitting of the ear, which sounds horrible, we're not talking about like getting a knife out and splitting the ear. It's just smacking the ear really, really hard and maybe causing a little bit of temporary damage. But basically, all of these are humiliating acts. They're not permanently physically damaging. That makes sense? So they are assessing, it seems, more or less a baseline penalty for doing these acts of humiliation. Now again, if you're comparing this to a ketubah, these are substantial penalties. These are not insignificant at all. 200, 400 zuzim is a substantial amount of money. It's not a fortune, but it's not chump change either. So spitting on someone you don't like in the street, or yanking their jacket off, the equivalent of pantsing someone perhaps, is not just a prank and who cares. That is actionable and comes with a substantial penalty. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Keep going.
This is the general principle. It all depends on a person's dignity. Rabbi Akiva said,
meaning that 400 zuz can be modified, and then there's an argument whether it be modified up or modified down, depending upon the relative status of the people involved. But that's our baseline assessment.
Even the poorest in Israel are considered as free men who had lost their estates, for they are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
What do you mean, dependent upon dignity? Because even a poor, penniless Israelite is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and therefore they should be right up there at the top of the social status scale. And don't be reducing their payments for humiliation just because they don't happen to be wealthy. Go Rabbi Akiva.
It once happened that a man uncovered a woman's head in the marketplace.
It did, as a deliberate, humiliating act.
He came before Rabbi Akiva and laid a complaint, and he fined him to pay her 400 zuz. The defendant said to him, Rabbi, grant me time to pay. And he gave him time.
Usually time to pay only would be for the amount of money that was being fined for the humiliation. Other forms of compensation like injury, healing, and loss and pain would have to be paid immediately and from the best of your property. You don't get to dilly-dally when settling up those debts. But for humiliation, they gave a little bit more leeway until it could be paid.
The defendant watched out for her, and when she was standing at the entrance of her courtyard, he broke. In front of her...
Oh, sorry, typo. He broke in front of her.
Oh, he broke in front of her a cruse wherein was an isar's worth of oil.
All right, let's make sure we got the scene here. As you might now have people who go out and do private investigation for personal injury cases or workman comp cases. You know, oh, you're too injured to work. Well, then why were you out rock climbing? You know, and then the case gets thrown out. He's setting something up. He's doing a little sting operation of his own because he's trying to prove that she is not so honorable as to be deserving the full 400 zuzim for having exposed her hair in public. So it's like, you know, so I made fun of her. She is such a, you know, pathetic woman that there's no real harm done. That's what he's going to try and prove by his little sting operation with this cruse of oil. And as you can see again from our scale of costs, an isar is a rather modest amount of money. We're not talking big bucks here. So he has a cruse of oil, and he just happens to drop it in front of her. And let's see what happens.
She uncovered her head, and scooping up the oil with her hand, she laid her hand on her head.
All right, so the idea here, at least from the commentaries that I've come across, is she rips off her head covering, she bends down and scoops up some of that oil, and she smooths it into her hair, which was considered a very, you know, good thing. This was a way of anointing oneself. So it's like, hey, good fortune for her. But what did she do?
She uncovered her hair.
She voluntarily uncovers her own hair in public for a pittance worth of oil that she's picking up off the ground. And this is the woman that Rabbi Akiva thinks that he has to pay 400 zuzim because he dishonored her? She's dishonoring herself in the street. She's getting oil from the gutter practically. I mean, come on. We're worried about her honor?
He had set eyewitnesses against her, and he came before Rabbi Akiva. He said to him, "Is it to a woman of this sort I have to give 400 zuz?"
Really? She's worth 400 zuz for her honor?
Rabbi Akiva replied to him, "Thou hast not said aught at all. For one who wounds himself, even though he is not permitted to do so, is exempt. But if others inflict a wound on him, they are liable. If one cut off his own plant, although he has no right to do so, he is exempt. But if others cut down his plant, they are liable."
Good technical.
Good technical. It's a basic principle. It's like, oh, you think you're so clever because you got her to dishonor herself in public? She's allowed. Not recommended, but she's allowed. You are not allowed to dishonor someone else just because you think they're not worthy of honor. Doesn't work like that. Any more than if someone asks you, you know, to break their hand, you are not allowed to break their hand. If they break their own hand, the court is not going to punish them for that. It's going to look at them rather funny, but they're not going to punish them. But if someone comes to you and says, "I want you to break my hand, I want you to cut me, I want you to stick me with needles," whatever, I guess acupuncturists are aside, but in a painful way, and don't worry about it, I'm not going to hold you responsible, I'm not going to charge you, you know, in court, there's going to be no penalty for this. If you hurt that person, even with their expressed, explicit, absolutely incontrovertible permission, the court can still penalize you for doing such. And even though they could have done it to themselves and the court would have not been able to say boo, if you do it to them, even with their permission, you are still responsible for your actions.
So they hopefully were redeeming the light in the eyes of the women. It used to be the law that, you know, for rape victims, evidence would be admitted about prior conduct or
Correct.
outside conduct. That is no longer the case.
Correct.
It is literally because of why men for centuries have had this need to denigrate a woman that they've done harm to is something that just has to be prevented.
Absolutely, and it's very true. You know, the idea that she wasn't worth being defended by the law. Because in some way or another, no harm was done because she was of such lowly character that you can't hurt a zero.
You can't write. It's not rape if she's already whatever.
Exactly. Rabbi Akiva and the tradition says, no, that's not the way we do things. No. That if someone has been humiliated even if they humiliate themselves regularly on other occasions, if you humiliate them, you are responsible for that deed. So even if your friend stands in the college courtyard throwing eggs on his head, that doesn't mean you get to throw an egg on his head.
Other topic. At what point does self-harm become a problem for the court?
When it becomes like a malignant issue, where it's clear that the person is ill and is going to continue to harm themselves in the long-term fashion, then the court intervenes simply under the case of dealing with people that are mentally incapable. But it's not a case of the scale of harm, it's more a case of the mental health of the person in question.
So a completely rational person who decides to take his life is not guilty in the eyes of the Jewish court?
No, they're guilty of taking their own life, but a completely rational person who decides one day that they just want to see what it feels like to be stabbed in the hand. We might also argue about their complete rationality, but if for some reason we were assuming that they were completely rational, the court could not punish them for stabbing a person in the hand. Someone taking their own life, there's a much more complicated interaction between Jewish law and the dealings with that person. Suicide is a more complicated subject. It is absolutely forbidden for a rational person to take their own life, and yet in most circumstances the assessment is that a person who takes their own life cannot be deemed to be rational. But that gets a lot more cloudy. Okay. I'm afraid we are out of time, which means our additional discussions on all the other laws will have to be for home study. So I just wanted to point out that we also began to look, we would have also begun to look, had we not spent so much time just on personal injury, at the damages our property can cause from the ox, the pit, the tooth, that means the chewing of the animal, right, and the outbreak of fire, which were the 4 different types of damages that we saw in the section of Mishpatim we looked at. We also noticed the issue of if an animal had been prone to violence before, that it had a higher standard of guarding against it. And the rabbis point out humans are considered to already have that higher standard of warning already given to them. So you can't say, oh, well, no one ever told me I wasn't allowed to punch people, and get away with your first offense. The moment you do anything that violates a commandment, you are considered to have been forewarned before you did that. You don't get to plead ignorance. And then finally, the very last section we read in Mishpatim deals with 4 different types of people who are taking care of your possessions. Someone who has borrowed it for free, someone that has been, I'm trying to make sure I got the right order here, someone who has borrowed it, someone who has rented it, someone who has been paid to look after it, and someone who is looking after it for you as a favor. And then the liability of each of those 4 categories of what happens if it dies, disappears, gets stolen, or what have you. So just a taste, tip of the iceberg of what Jewish society has done for the last few thousand years to try and make sure that Torah is not simply a static expression of limited general principles, but is taken apart into all of its glory so that we can examine each and every element of it in order to understand it and in order to use it. And even though we don't get to adjudicate on these issues anymore, we don't generally have the capacity to enforce these penalties within a Jewish community or to rule vis-a-vis who borrowed what from whom, that doesn't mean that we are not still as Jews governed by these principles. So if you were to borrow something and it were to be damaged, you would be culpable before God according to Torah, even if the American judicial system said you were off the hook.
At which point, the American judicial system, this is considered a law of bailment, the borrowing, renting.
Right.
They line up pretty neatly.
Good. That's good to know. So it is still important to learn this, if you haven't in the past, because you are still responsible before the throne of heaven, even if not before the throne of the state. And we'll talk another time about what happens when those are in absolute conflict, but that's a much longer conversation.
Yeah.